get you, Barbara.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Two Guys and a Chainsaw. I'm Todd.
And I'm Craig.
Well, Craig, it has come to this. We have been doing this podcast for a little over almost 2 years now.
Yeah.
And last week we were hit with the news that George Romero has died.
Yeah, it's sad.
And George Romero is an icon. I don't know about you, but Night of the Living Dead, his first film, his most iconic film, also happens to be one of the most memorable from my childhood.
It's funny because it's so iconic, and of course, everybody's heard of it, but I don't think that I actually saw the original until I was an adult. It's funny now that we're going to be talking about it, and we call ourselves kind of a review podcast, and it almost feels like sacrilege to review this movie. You know, it's you know, what is there to say? What is there to say about this movie that hasn't already been said? It's a classic, but we thought that it would be, you know, we talked about doing this movie a lot of times, and it just seemed a fitting time.
Yeah. Like you said, there are just some movies that almost seem pointless for us to do because they're too easy.
Right.
But maybe, maybe we have a lot of younger listeners, maybe people that have heard of it but don't want to watch a black and white movie, don't think it's going to be scary or don't think it's going to be worth their time. Maybe after they sit and listen to us talk about it and spoil it all, then they'll sit down and want to give it another look. We'll see. I'll tell you, the thing that really got me about this film, and I watched it when I was young, it is probably the first movie that I ever saw that I could say was bleak, that just absolutely ends poorly for everyone involved. Big spoiler alert. And we'll talk about it more later, but that had a really profound impact on me as a kid. I just never I honestly do not think that before I saw this movie that I'd ever seen a movie that ended badly, ever really had a story that's so tragic. I don't know, Romeo and Juliet or whatever. I don't think I was reading Romeo and Juliet. I'm sure I saw this movie before I read Shakespeare. But yeah, this movie just really opened my eyes to the fact that the world isn't always a safe, happy place, that things don't always turn out for the best. And it really forced me to seek out more movies like this. And honestly, maybe was responsible more than anything else for getting me into the horror genre in the first place.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. Again, like I said, I don't think I really saw it until I was an adult. I mean, I had seen references to it. I had seen clips all over the place. But the movie came out in 1968, which was well before our time. That was more our parents' time. And when it came out, the MPAA hadn't even been created yet. I think it was created like maybe the next year or something like that, or maybe even the same year, but after the release of this movie. And so this movie was presented in the way that many horror movies were presented at the time. It was matinee fare. The target audience for that matinee fare was kids, like adolescents and teenagers. And even young kids were going in and seeing this movie. And I think it was pretty shocking for them because, like you said, it is bleak and it is scary. And, it's funny. I'm sure we'll talk about the bazillions of movies that were inspired by this, or at least that this movie had some influence on. But up until this time, people had never really seen a horror movie like this, where there was a lot of gore and violence. Up until now, it had been, Bela Lugosi and the classic Universal monsters, and so this was
stuff, right? Like sci-fi, cheesy, low budget thrills.
Yeah. And fun stuff, but very, very different from this. This is bleak, it is dreary, and it is violent and gory, and it shocked a lot of people. And I think that may be part of the reason why it ended up doing so well. This is one of the most successful independent films of all time. I mean, they filmed it on a budget of, I think, $114,000, and worldwide it ended up grossing like $30+ million. And I think that it was more successful outside of America than it was in America, but it was successful here too. And it really ushered in a brand new era of horror. And I mean, that's cool. I mean, just from a
Yeah.
historical perspective, that's such a cool thing. And for this to be, George Romero had been working in the industry a little bit. He worked on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and he had done some other, commercials and I think some public access stuff. But this was his first movie, and they filmed it on such a low budget, and the impact that it made on cinematic history is just it's amazing.
And you mentioned the worldwide gross and all that. It's well known now that George Romero and his original backers never saw much of any of that money.
Right.
It's also kind of a big tragedy that the movie was originally called Night of the Flesh Eaters, and when he found distribution for it, the distributor decided they wanted to change the title to Night of the Living Dead. So when they got into the film footage and changed the title card of the movie, what they neglected to add to it or keep on it was the copyright notice.
Yeah.
And copyright law at that time was really stupid. And it basically just said if you didn't have a copyright notice on your work, that you immediately forfeit copyright to it.
Right,
So,
public domain.
so the minute it was released, unfortunately, to the theaters, they lost copyright to it, and it was his distributor that got all the money. And that was something that really haunted him for quite a while. But I will tell you that it's because of that. Maybe this movie wouldn't have had the reach through the years that it's had today if it were not for that. I mean, it's hard to say, because that is, I guarantee you, the reason why I saw it as a kid, years later in the 80s, is because this movie was free for anybody to put on television, to put on cable. You could go to a dollar store and see VHS copies and later DVDs out the yin-yang. Most of them really poor copies of copies, but copies nonetheless. This was a really easy horror movie to find. So
yeah, that's how I got my copy. I got it, in a department store in one of those $1 bins.
Exactly. And there would be like parody shows on TV where they would take old public domain movies. Mystery Science Theater obviously did it a lot, but even before Mystery Science Theater, even Nickelodeon had a TV show called Turkey TV, which I think was something they imported from Canada. It was like on Canadian TV, but Nickelodeon had it in syndication. And I remember seeing a parody of this where they had replaced the dialogue with funny dialogue, and of course they cut out all the the bad bits and just and made it funny. And so this movie just maybe even more so became part of the pop culture landscape because it was so widely available to anybody. And with that killer title and the notoriety that came after it, it just seemed to have lasted through all those years. And really, honestly, still holds up today. I really feel like
I think so. Yeah, I think it totally holds up today. It's a good movie. And you said, we've got some younger viewers who maybe are not super interested in old black and white movies. And frankly, I'm one of those assholes.
Oh, you're a color snob.
I typically don't seek out older films like this, but this is one, it really stands up. I mean, oh gosh, there's some great acting, there's some not so great acting, but even the not so great acting still fits well within the context of this film. And especially considering that this is a man's first movie, it's really strong. Like, it's good storytelling, it's well paced, it's well shot, it's good to look at, like it looks good. I just find it so impressive on so many levels.
And going back and watching it now, and this is the first time I've seen it in, I don't know, probably
years.
Yeah, many years. We were able to find a nice HD quality version on YouTube, and I'll put a link to that on our website. But if you go back, for so many years, I grew up on watching these kind of terrible copies of it. And on one hand, the terrible copies of it do the movie a bit more justice, because the muddier it is in places, the better the makeup looks.
Agreed. And just like some of the less quality copies, it almost makes it feel grittier. And the movie actually got some praise for that, because this was because of the time period when it was taking place, the Vietnam War was very much in people's minds, and people, so much news footage had come out of there, and it was all very raw and gritty. And this movie got some praise for kind of, whether it was intentional or unintentional, kind of emulating that feel. Yeah. So some of the grittier copies, this movie almost feels like it should be gritty based on the context. When you clean it up, it looks nice. It's nice to see people in clear focus, but you're right. Some of the makeup effects show, and because they were doing this on a really low budget, and so it's a zombie movie, and they thought, well, we don't have a lot of money, so let's just kind of make the zombies pale-faced with dark circles around their eyes. And you see that in some of the zombies. But as they went on, they're like, well, let's try some different stuff. and they started using mortician's plastic and rubber and makeup to kind of give some more effects of decay and stuff. And you can see both. You can see the dark-eyed, pale zombies, but you also get some shots of the zombies who are in a further state of decay, and they all look good. But yeah, when you see it in a really clear 4K transfer or whatever, I mean, you can tell it's makeup, but it still looks good regardless.
Yeah, and the one thing that is exposed in the 4K transfer is the quality of the filming. The cinematography in this movie is pretty good. The lighting is good. The scenes are lit in very dramatic ways. Until now, I hadn't really paid attention critically to the way that George Romero had framed up his shots and had lit his scenes and things. But I have a really high level of respect for him. I've always had a high level of respect for him.
Sure.
But even more so to see that his really showed a lot of this talent right out of the gate. Of course, like you said, he'd worked in other things before. So, nobody comes in with all these skills right off the bat. But when you're going into a movie, we've seen tons of low-budget films that you have to make apologies for those kinds of things.
Right.
And you don't have to make any apologies about almost anything about this movie, really. The writing is good. The acting, as you said, is good. The cinematography is good. The lighting is good. He's doing some really innovative for the time things with the camera. At times it's handheld. The shots, too, I noticed there were moments where the shots were very askew. At moments of high tension. And that's something that, had kind of escaped my notice before. But, that is a kind of an advanced technique of really giving you a psychological feeling of unease just by the way that you frame the shot that a first-time filmmaker wouldn't necessarily think to do.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like this is just one of those examples where things just kind of fell into place. Like every once in a while, with a movie or whatever, anything, all the right pieces fall into place and it just works so well, despite the fact that maybe it shouldn't have. The fact that this was this guy's first movie, it was shot on a low budget. It was shot with mostly, non-mainstream actors. But it just, you mentioned the writing. I agree with you. The writing seems really good. It's good storytelling and the characters are really good. But in researching this, I found out that a lot of the dialogue was improvised as they went along.
Really?
And yeah, and even the casting of the main character. The main character is the hero, really, of the movie is named Ben, and he's a man named Dwayne Jones. And this character was written as a dumb trucker. And when they did the auditions, Romero cast this guy, Dwayne Jones, and he was an African-American man. And it was not written for an African-American man. It was written for a white man. But Romero, faced lots of scrutiny at the time. And really, I think throughout his life, people were saying, did you just cast this guy because he was a black guy? And he says, absolutely not. It was just that he came in and he did the best audition. Dwayne Jones was a trained stage actor, and he was also a professor of English. He was a highly educated man. Like I said, it was written to kind of be this kind of dumb guy, and he didn't want to play it that way, and so he didn't play it that way, and he rewrote and revised a lot of the dialogue to really be more reflective of himself as an educated, strong black man. And in 1968, that was just unheard of, to have a strong black male protagonist, especially in a movie where he's the only black guy.
Yeah.
And he's the hero, and he plays it so strong. This guy comes in and immediately he's resourceful and smart and even keeled and level headed.
Don't worry about him, I can handle him. Probably be a lot more of them as soon as they find out about us. The truck is out of gas. This pump out here is locked. Is there a key?
And I mean, you just root for him throughout because he's such a badass.
You love him. You do. You just love him from the beginning, don't you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Especially with what he's contrasted with. And that's why I think, again, this being a happy accident, man, it really did fall into place like a perfect puzzle. We might as well go back and just kind of jump into the plot real quick.
Yep. Go for it.
It starts out with a car driving down the road, and it's Johnny and Barbara, two very white people.
Yeah.
Laughably white bread people driving down the road, going to put some flowers on Johnny's mother's grave. And you, at first, in fact, I actually, to this day, I thought that they were boyfriend-girlfriend. It wasn't until this viewing that I realized that they're brother and sister. That just totally escaped me, even though they're referred to as brother and sister like several times in this movie.
Right.
Anyway, so they're going to go put the flowers on this grave. It's his mother's grave, right?
No, it's their dad.
Oh, it's their dad.
Yeah, because they have this whole shtick about how the Johnny, the brother's like,
I don't even remember what the man looks like.
Johnny, it takes you 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes to put the wreath on the grave and 6 hours to drive back and forth. Mother wants to remember, so we trot 200 miles into the country and she stays at home.
Well, we're here, John, all right?
And he's such a jackass. He's like, I don't even care. And she's
kind of an airhead.
She is an airhead. She's like kind of this doe-eyed, silly girl. And she kind of remains that way throughout, which, again, I'm not going to really offer any real criticism of this movie because I think that as it is, it's just fantastic. But if I were to offer any criticism at all, she is really, I guess you would call her the heroine of the movie, but she's pretty lame.
She's lame. And
as a character, not as a performance. I appreciate the performance, just the characters. She's weak. She's a weak character.
Well, she starts out as the heroine, and I think he kind of subverts that about a third of the way through the movie when you realize that she's not going to be any help to anybody. It's kind of a movie without a heroine in a way. I feel like Ben ends up being the guy.
Yeah, absolutely, no question.
Anyway, they get there, they lay the flowers on the grave, and they have a bit of, okay, so this part's a little forced. Their dialogue when they're talking about when they went back there as kids, and who knows why they were playing in a graveyard as kids, especially presumably 3 hours drive away from their home. I don't know.
Yeah.
They have some dialogue about how she was always scared, and Johnny would jump out from behind a tree and scare her, and she goes, don't do that. It makes me frightened. And that leads to this line that comes in his taunting of her that is so iconic, which is,
"They're coming to get you, Barbara."
Oh, God. Yeah. I don't care if it's forced. I don't care if it's cheesy. I mean, that is just so iconic. We've seen it parodied. I mean, we've reviewed movies where they've parodied it. Mm-hmm. And it's just that line. I just love it. I love it so much. And it's because they see kind of this like ambling, shuffling guy in the background, and he's teasing her like, "Oh, look, there they are. They're coming to get you, Barbara." And meanwhile, knowing the context of the movie, we know that this is a zombie that's coming around. Yeah. And it does attack her. It's silly and it's funny, but oh gosh, I love it so much. I was just, watching this again, like I said, for the first time in years. I was just waiting. I'm like, say it. It's like Rocky. It's like Rocky Horror Picture Show or something. You're just waiting for the line. Come on.
That's right.
It's so good. I love it.
And again, talking about inspirations, you have to feel like the screenwriters of It Follows were watching this opening scene and going, I've got an idea for a movie, because it is so casually presented. And this, again, is just the genius of how this is shot for such a low-budget, cheap movie. He's so casually presented in the background. before they even point him out, you can kind of see him way off, out of focus in the back, just shuffling along, just like another person in the cemetery walking along.
Right.
They make a little brief mention of him, and you kind of see him back there throughout the rest of the scene, but the focus is so much on Johnny and Barbara that you almost forget about him, except for the fact that you're watching a movie called Night of the Living Dead, and you think this is going to have to be significant, right? Barbara walks right up to him like she's going to apologize, and he grabs her and starts to, wrestle with her. It's like he's, I guess, going to try to eat her. And Johnny throws her aside, and he wrestles with him. And Johnny gets knocked out on a tombstone. And the guy doesn't start digging in to eat Johnny. He jumps up and seems to be more interested in Barbara. And so he ambles off against her. And here's where we see the first of these things that George Romero, I think he clearly had to make some choices here. This isn't the first zombie movie that's come along, right? We had, even back, like you mentioned, Bela Lugosi, we had White Zombie. Mm-hmm. It was always set kind of in voodoo and Haitian. This was the difference that Romero brought to it, as he kind of updated it to the modern day and gave you a different reason for the zombies. But he had to make some choices throughout this movie. How are they going to act? How are they going to... What are the rules, as it were? What happens when you get bitten? Does anything happen when you get bitten? Who becomes a zombie? When do you become a zombie? All these questions get answered as the movie goes on, and those answers get doled out little by little, which is another really cool aspect to the writing, I think. Two things that surprised me, even all many years later, is first of all, this guy, he's ambling and shuffling a little bit, but then when he wants to, he can move.
Yeah.
He really kind of runs after her, honestly, and chases her to the car. She gets in the car. She tries to go, but she doesn't have the keys because Johnny had the keys. And she just puts it in neutral, which is something, you could do back then when we didn't have automatics.
Right.
And, but this guy is coming to her and trying to, punch his way through the window, and he can't. So then he turns around and looks on the ground and grabs a brick and chucks the brick through the window. So not only do you get this zombie that isn't always necessarily shambling along, but they have some level of intelligence, at least a little bit.
Well, and watching this, it just made me think that we have seen so many zombie movies in our lives that we kind of have these expectations. I try to put myself back in the mindset of somebody who's not us, who hasn't seen these millions of zombie movies, in fact, who maybe has never seen a zombie movie at all. And so they would have no idea what the rules were or what the expectations were or even what was going on.
That's right.
So everything would be new and a surprise. It would be a revelation to them when it's revealed in the film that being bit by one of these creatures could infect you and kill you and make you a zombie. I don't know. Like, it's so wild to think this is where it all began because we're so used to it. We're so submerged in it. It's just cool to look back at this as kind of a relic.
Yeah, it really is. And it's interesting to see how that got reinterpreted over the years, right? Like, for the longest time, even after this movie, you got the sense in most zombie movies after that getting bitten infected you. There was that whole aspect of the eat your brains that became popular, even though it's never a thing in this movie that zombies eat brains in particular. It's just that they're craving human flesh. It almost kind of takes a step back from this movie, some of the subsequent movies, in that the zombies aren't portrayed as particularly intelligent. Right. Oh, yeah. And then later on, we get, like 28 Days Later, where the modern zombie can run. It's kind of like, I don't know. We could list off hundreds of these movies, but there are all these different little takes on it. But it's funny to see the things that came from this movie, and some of the things that were dropped, that came from this movie that were then later picked up or later played with. And I think he said, a lot of his choices were sometimes matters of necessity, just like what could they afford to do, what could they not afford to do, what was convenient for them in rushing through this movie as it's written. And so, again, it's not like he necessarily sat down at a paper on one cold October afternoon and drew up everything. just like every work of art, it's kind of a work in process that happens over time. So,
well, and what the other thing is, what's interesting is that because no such thing as a zombie movie, well, like you said, there had been like White Zombie and a couple other things, but Romero's idea of what zombies were really kind of the historical idea of zombies, which are living people who are somehow possessed or entranced by voodoo witch doctors, like in the Caribbean and places like that. And so that was kind of the concept of what a zombie was at the time. So Romero wasn't setting out to make a zombie movie.
Right.
In fact, he was inspired by I Am Legend, not any of the films or adaptations, but the original novel, I Am Legend, and he wanted to do something like that. He liked the idea of one man being the sole survivor of this epidemic that killed everybody else off, but then people were coming back, but they were monstrous or whatever, and he kind of wanted to pull it back a little bit further. Let's not start where there's only one man left. Let's go back to when this outbreak happened and people were starting to die off. He was so inspired by the novel that I read that he said somewhere, I couldn't make them vampires because that's what they were in the novel, and I couldn't copy it that directly. So I had to make it something else, and this is the something else that he came up with. And they don't call them zombies in the movie.
Absolutely not.
They refer to them as murderers and assassins and eventually ghouls, but the word zombie is never mentioned in this movie. It was only after this came out and inspired so many other things that we started using that word to refer to these types of antagonists. And again, like, geez, how cool is that to create something that has become such a huge part of our culture today? I mean, look, The Walking Dead is one of the most popular series on television. Romero himself was not a big fan of The Walking Dead, but regardless of the fact that he wasn't a fan, clearly, he inspired this huge subgenre of horror. And I'll apparently just continue to keep gushing about it.
This could be a very long episode.
No. I feel like that's the thing. Like, I feel like we should get into the plot because it's important. Really, what's important about the plot is that Barbara runs away and she ends up finding this farmhouse where she's alone for a little while, but then eventually Ben, our true hero, shows up and she's basically worthless. I mean, she's pretty much catatonic and just kind of walking around in a catatonic state.
Annoyingly so.
Yeah, but he comes in and he's like, let's board up the house. Let's figure out what we're going to do. Like
he is all action.
Exactly. And he is all action. And he does it all by himself. Like, he is just he is the man, and he's boarding up all the windows and he's boarding up all the doors, and they're fighting off zombies all the time. And like, again, he just knows what to do. He's seen things. The first time he saw zombies was like at this gas station, and there was a fire, and he saw that they were afraid of fire. So he's lighting things on fire and throwing them outside to keep the zombies at bay. And it works. Like, this guy is just so practical and knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
Eventually, these two other guys pop out of the cellar. They had no idea they were down there. And as it turns out, they had been there for a while, and they've been hiding out in the cellar because that's the safest place. They've got these big boards they can board up the cellar door with. Another one of my favorite parts of the movie, one of my favorite lines of the movie, is when these guys come out. Ben, the main guy, is like,
how long you guys been down there? I could use some help up here.
That's the cellar. It's the safest place.
You mean you didn't hear the racket we were making up here?
How are we supposed to know what was going on? Could have been those things for all we knew.
That girl was screaming. Sure, you must know what a girl screaming sounds like. Those things don't make any noise. Anybody would know somebody ever needed help.
Look, it's kind of hard to hear what's going on from down there.
We thought we could hear screams, but for all we knew, that could have meant those things were in the house afterward.
And you wouldn't come up and help?
Well, if there were more...
The racket sounded like the place was being ripped apart. How were we supposed to know what was going on?
Now, wait a minute. You just got finished saying you couldn't hear from down there. Now you say it sounded like the place was being ripped apart. It would be nice if you get your story straight, man.
That's so true. It's like you were just listening the whole time. Like, what did you think was going on up here?
Oh, I just thought that was so funny. So the people who are down in the basement are Mr. and Mrs. Cooper, Harry and Helen Cooper, and they have a kid. And all we find out about the kid is that she's hurt. We don't really know what's wrong with her at first. We find out later. And then there's also this teenage couple, Tom and Judy, down there. And so then everybody gets mixed up. And then this is what becomes the heart of the movie. And this is really what Romero, I think, is most respected for, is that he sets up these horrific scenarios. But what the movie is really about is about human interaction. You know, yes, they're dealing with zombies trying to come in from the inside, but the way that the humans interact with one another is potentially just as horrible and horrific. And I think that that is really what cemented Romero's legacy, is that he was able to really tell human stories in these extreme circumstances. And he just does a really, really good job at it.
Yeah, you know, he starts out really playing to the survivalist fantasy. Right? We've all kind of imagined, like, what are we going to do if, like, some terrible thing happens? It's up to us to, you know, defend our house. And so how Ben comes in here with a plan, and he's searching for tools, and he's grabbing nails, and he's like taking doors off of their hinges to use to board up the walls, and he's making this house into a fortress, and he's succeeding at it. You know, you're thinking, yeah, this is a guy I can get behind. And he's played off against Barbara, who's this blubbering idiot who's telling stories that don't even make sense, who you just hate because she's absolutely useless, and this guy's going to end up protecting her. That she doesn't deserve to be protected, but, you know, you kind of feel like she doesn't deserve to be protected.
Right.
So he's got like this whole survivalist fantasy, you know, worked up in you, and then introduces these disparate characters, which then devolves into this Lord of the Flies type situation where,
right,
you know, part of our survivalist fantasy is this thought that we can all band together, you know, and we can beat this outside force, or that even though we might have our differences, when we're faced with a common enemy, we see it in literature all the time, but, you know, Romero does it here too, where he just breaks that down and destroys it. You know, he set up this fantasy, and then he's shown you why it's ultimately fantasy.
Right. Yeah. Oh, gosh. And you mentioned Barbara tells that story. Play that clip because it's so funny.
We came to put a wreath on my father's grave, Johnny, and he said, "Can I have some candy, Barbara?" We didn't have any. And he said, "Oh, it's late. Why did we start so late?" And I said, "Johnny, if you'd gotten up earlier, we wouldn't be late." Johnny asked me if I were afraid. And I said, "I'm not afraid, Johnny." And then this man started walking up the road. He came slowly, and Johnny kept teasing me and saying, "He's coming to get you, Barbara." And I laughed at him and said, "Johnny, stop it." And then Johnny ran away. And I went up to this man, and I was going to apologize.
Why don't you just keep calm?
And I looked up, and I said, "Goody." And he grabbed me. He grabbed me, and he ripped at me. He held me, and he ripped at my clothes.
I think you should just calm down.
Oh, I screamed, "Johnny! Johnny, help me! Oh, help me!" And he wouldn't let me go. He ripped.
It's so funny and so pathetic, but again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this was ad-libbed, and this is one of the parts that was ad-libbed. You know, Romero just told her, "You've got to tell the story of what happened to you in the cemetery," and she rolls it out in such I mean, it seems stupid, but honestly, this woman was traumatized.
Yes.
She probably is in shock, and we're crapping on her as a character, which I think is fair because she is such a weak character. But she plays, the actress, Judith O'Dea, plays it really well. I mean, it's really believable. Yeah, you don't particularly like her as a character, but she plays it in a really believable way. So I've got to at least give her credit for that. You do want to slap her around. And at one point, Ben does.
Yeah.
She's hysterical, and she slaps him, I think, and he just punches her out.
Like, this is for the best.
Yeah, and it is. And again, that's another reason why I feel like he's such a cool character, because he's so practical. Like, I'm just going to have to take you out for a while. And he does. And he's kind to her afterwards, once she's calmed down, and he's protective of her afterwards. And I feel like this guy, you know, again, being his freshman take on this movie, he was just so brave in doing stuff like that. Having a black man punch a white woman in a 1968 film, and then having that man be the hero of your film. I mean, what was he thinking? You know?
Well, you know, he says he wasn't even thinking. He said it wasn't until later. Now, I don't know if I believe this. I can't really believe this. But he said it wasn't until later that when people started talking about it that he realized the implications of the casting of a black man in this movie. Now, I'm sorry, but the movie's dripping with all kinds of if that's the case, lots of very convenient subtext in a lot of different scenes. You know, even when I was a kid, I felt like the underlying tension, perhaps, between Harry and Ben was a racial thing. Now, this time when I watched it again with that knowledge of, you know, George Romero saying it was an accident, I could see how it's not really written that way, but just his presence in the movie and some of the looks that they give each other and the way he treats him, I think maybe even as a kid I was just so tuned into the unfair way in which African Americans are treated in America that I read that right into their relationship in the movie, and it works.
Yes, works really well.
Which then, again, makes it all the more subversive that he's the hero of the movie. Whether it's a happy accident or not, you just have to evaluate works of art as they turn out, and it's great in that aspect. It really serves. It really tells that message. It's there for sure.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And especially because the guy that plays Harry he's just a jerk. You know, he's played by a guy named Carl Hardman, and he's, you know, kind of your typical middle-aged, entitled white guy who just thinks he's right and everybody should listen to him when he's not. You know, he's wrong and he's illogical. He wants to lock them all up down in the basement, and Ben is like, no, that's, you know, you're trapping yourself down here. Up here we've got all kinds of options. We can run upstairs, we can run outside if we need to, but if you trap yourself down there in that basement, then you're just stuck. And that becomes a big conflict. But really, the whole middle part of the movie is just them in the house interacting with one another and not knowing what's going on. And they're just getting little bits of information from the radio and from the television from time to time. And I thought that the segments where they're listening to what's going on the radio and the TV were so effective because they are just getting little bits and pieces. At first, the radio people are like, we don't really know what's going on. You know, lock yourselves up in your houses. It appears to be a mass murder by unknown assassins. We don't know. Lock yourself up in your houses. And then later,
civil defense officials in Cumberland have told newsmen that murder victims show evidence of having been partially devoured by their murderers.
And you've got to get to rescue stations. There are rescue stations set up in every city at hospitals and police stations and public buildings and whatnot. Eventually it gets to this big explanation, which as I was watching this again this time, part of what I appreciated in the first half of the movie, I was like, oh, they're not going to try to explain why this is happening. And I liked that. I thought we don't really need to know why this is happening. That's not really important. But I forgot that they do eventually explain, at least potentially, why this is happening.
So far, all the betting on the answer to that question centers on the recent Explorer satellite shot to Venus. That satellite, you'll recall, started back to Earth, but never got here. That's the space vehicle which orbited Venus and then was purposely destroyed by NASA when scientists discovered it was carrying a mysterious high-level radiation with it.
And they don't ever confirm that that's definitively why this is happening, but it's suggested. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. But I just found, all of that reporting on the radio and TV to really be an effective way to kind of inform the plot and inform the characters. I just really liked it.
I did too, and it was a little dated, but doesn't really matter. But I found like the radio and the TV really puts you in that house with them. I was kind of sitting there on the edge of my seat waiting to hear the latest development or what little bits and tidbits of explanation they could give us, which is exactly how those guys in the house were. And it was really well done too, I thought. Aside from the fact that you'd want to see bigger crowds and maybe more news people, they couldn't do as much with the budget that they had. It does seem to focus on that local area around which they are, which is fine because that's how generally you would get your news. I guess they probably weren't tuned into a major network. It looked like it was more of a regional channel. That they had to move the bunny ears.
Right.
But this was an interesting aspect of it as well, and I have to feel like there's a message here too. When I was watching The Land of the Dead, that came out 2006 or 2007. I went there with a bunch of college students. And we watched it, and I thought that movie was fun, too. And Romero's films always have something to say. He took this genre, and he didn't just create it, but he owned it. He said, I'm going to do stuff with it. And every one of his movies is a little different in what it's trying to get across with the zombies. And it feels, though, that the thread that goes throughout all of them is just the unmistakable, unshakable, and unstoppable force of progress, for good or for bad. What is humanity doing? We're moving forward, and just like these zombies, and ultimately, whether it's good or bad, there's very little or nothing that can be done to stop the constant overturning of the status quo. And I feel like even that theme is present, again, whether it was intentional or not, in this first movie. Because when Barbara first gets into this house, even for 1968, this is an old house. It's an old farmhouse, so it has stood at least for decades. It's out in the middle of a field. We're in a very rural setting. The television that they have has to be hauled down from the upstairs. It's not like, in a prominent place in the home. It's like a really old person in 1968 who maybe has a TV but doesn't use it very often. There's an old-looking radio that he turns on. Again, for 1968, this radio is classic. It's like a 1920, 1930 style radio that they're using. And so I feel like even the fact that they're boarded up in this house that's overtaken by the zombies, that this house just stands as a testament to the status quo, the old conservative time that has been passed by. Even at this time. Yeah. And the fact that when they get there, the owner of the house is dead. They don't even get to meet her. Like, she's one of the first casualties, and it happens off screen. Yep. But she's been dead for a while, and she's decayed. And, it's funny that she doesn't come back to life.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point of that movie that I'm not sure if that was just overlooked or if there's a message there as well.
I don't know. It's just kind of unanswered, I think. But the fact that it is set in this kind of I don't know if mundane is the right word, but this suburban rural setting, again, that was something that was kind of new and innovative. I mentioned before, all of those old horror movies, monster movies, they were set in exotic places, Transylvania, or all of these crazy weird places, and this was set at home. For most of America, this is where you live. This is small town, this is rural, and this could happen here. It doesn't have to be some exotic locale. Something horrific could happen here. And that was virtually unheard of at that time, which is, it just blows the mind. Like, that's so common now, for you to see things set in these normal places. But at the time, that had not really happened in horror. And it's good for you, George Romero.
You've done so much for us. I would go out to lay some flowers on his grave, but I'm worried about that guy shuffling in the background. I just gotta say.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, again, there's so much. We could talk so much about plot. There's so much that goes on, but it's really just a lot of human drama in this house. The big things that happen are there's a gas pump outside, which, again, you youngins who listen, you probably won't think about this, but that wasn't uncommon, especially in rural areas. Private people sometimes had their own gas pumps, or there would be a local gas pump at just some random farmhouse where people could go and get gas. So there's a gas pump there, and at first they can't find the keys, but then it turns out the keys are in the basement, and then Ben and Tom go on this mission to get gas, and you really think, because this is late in the movie, you're like, oh yeah, they're going to get the gas and they're going to get out of here, but it just ends up being a total blunder. They go out there and they can't get the key that was labeled gas doesn't really unlock the pump, and so Ben has to shoot it. And then when Tom pulls the gas out, and this is after he's said multiple times how he knows his way around these things, he pulls it out and he just shoots gasoline all over the place. And he shoots it all over the ground.
It's like that gasoline fight in Zoolander.
Yeah, it totally is. And so the truck catches on fire, and the girlfriend Judy had followed them out there, so she's in the truck, and Tom and Judy get in the truck and they try to drive away, but and they stop, and Tom tries to get Judy out, but her shirt is stuck in the door, and they end up getting blown up in there. And, it's sad that they die, because you like them as characters. They're very nice young people, good looking young people. You don't want them to die, but they do. And then there's probably the most grotesque scene of the movie, where the zombies are eating their guts and just eating their arms and stuff. And I read that everything that they were eating was just ham covered in chocolate sauce. and apparently that combination was so repulsive that they joked that they really didn't even need to put any makeup on the extras, because they all looked so sick just having to eat this stuff. But it's, as funny as that is, I mean, it's a really pivotal point of the movie, because that's really been their only hope for salvation has been this truck, and you really think that they're gonna get away, and then the truck blows up, and that's just it. There's really just no hope.
Yeah, and it's again, this is like the beginning of the bleakness for me. Like, as a kid, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, not only did their plan go awry, but it just kind of fizzled out in the dumbest way.
Yeah,
here people are supposed to know what they're doing, who just screwed up, just dumped a bunch of gas everywhere. Oh crap, couldn't get away. Like, there's nothing super dramatic about it.
Right.
It's just, wow, now they're dead, and now they get the added injustice of having their bodies picked apart and eaten by these people, which is the first time that we see this, right? This is the first time that we actually see human flesh being devoured. And I think it was really smart to pace this out a little later in the movie, because this movie just builds. It does a really good job of that.
Yeah. And I think that the news reports do a lot to help that, because we keep getting more and more information. Like, at first it was just murderers, and then it's these murderers that are eating their victims. And then we come to find out that if you are bitten by one of these things, ghouls as they call them, then you're infected and you'll eventually die and immediately become one of them. There's a report on the news.
In the cold room at the university, we had a cadaver from which all 4 limbs had been amputated. Sometime early this morning, it opened its eyes and began to move its trunk. It was dead, but it opened its eyes and tried to move.
I feel like the guy on the news literally says, drag them out in the street, douse them in gasoline, and set them on fire.
That's right. But he's got a very nice, like, 1950s style of way of saying this. You know, back when people were a little more eloquent and sensitive in their speech.
The bereaved will have to forego the dubious comforts that a funeral service will give. They're just dead flesh.
Well, it couldn't be more direct than that.
Right. And we get that, and we also eventually get the information that they're really not difficult to kill. You just have to make sure that you destroy their brain. It's the brain that has been reanimated. You have to destroy that. After the whole explosion outside, then the zombies become very aggressive, and they're getting in the house. And there's lots of other things, like when Ben comes back from this little expedition.
Oh my gosh.
Harry's supposed to let him back in, but he doesn't. You can see the internal conflict. Do I let this guy back in and risk letting the zombies get in, or do I just lock myself and my family up in the basement? And as much of a jerk as this guy is, I do feel like Romero and the actor did a good job of portraying that conflict. Like, it's not just, oh, I'm a jerk, so I don't care. It's weighing your options.
And it's great because he could have been a cardboard cutout character, but because he's played against these other characters in a very skillful way, he's not. Like, even toward the beginning of the movie when he's doing the arguing for locking themselves in the cellar and he finally stomps off to the cellar, we get a scene of him talking with his wife. And his wife it almost seems like his wife barely puts up with him, right? And
oh my God, another one of my favorite lines of the movie. She says something like,
"We may not enjoy living together, but dying together isn't going to solve anything."
You know, you get this idea of their relationship in a very brief period of time. These are people who are clearly not happy people.
Yeah, and she even brings up, I mean, you can tell what the conflict is. Like, he says something about how he's right, and she says, "Oh, well, that's what's most important to you, isn't it?"
Being right.
Yeah, and again, it's a problem in their relationship. It's clearly a character flaw that he has, and so it's, you know, it adds some depth to his character. At least it gives some depth to his character that keeps him from being this cardboard cutout. And sure enough,
yes,
when Ben kicks in the door anyway and comes in, man, does he give a look to Harry. But he's way more...
Gives him a look. He beats the shit out of him.
Well, he eventually does. But what I'm saying is, like, he, at first, you know, he's got to board it back up, and Harry comes back out and starts helping him nail the boards back up. You know, he could have just had Harry, like, lock himself in the cellar completely. But you see that little bit of guilt there, right? The guilt.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And you're right. He beats the crap out of him, and you were so happy that he does it too. You're like, that's right, man. Within an inch of his life.
But at the same time, I'm thinking, you probably have better things to do.
Well, he ends up shooting him.
Yeah.
And this is another really shocking thing of this movie, is that our hero, Ben, at some point realizes that some of these people are goners, and it's better for him to just hasten their end than it is for him to try to save them. He's decided Harry is no good, and so he just shoots him with the rifle.
It's because as he's boarding up the doors, he drops the gun, and Harry takes it and is pointing it at him and is saying, "I'm going down here with my family, screw you." And eventually Ben fights him and gets the gun back and just shoots him. Yeah. And that is shocking because you don't expect that kind of behavior from a hero, but realistically, in the heat of the moment, that was probably the right thing to do. Like, this guy does not have your interest in mind at all. If your interest in surviving, you got to look out for yourself.
I would call it like a real Walking Dead moment. It's like where there are no good options, and so people end up doing something that is going to be morally repugnant anyway, but at least it's the one that's going to save their skin.
Right.
Even still, even after being threatened, even after fighting him off, you don't often see in a movie where the hero finally gets the gun and then just shoots the guy.
Right. Right.
And this leads up to the scenes because while they're fighting, Barbara is being besieged by zombies, and they're reaching through the door. And there are just 3 moments in this movie, just in quick succession, that all happened at the end that just devastated me as a kid.
Yeah.
And the first of them is the fact that Barbara gets pulled out by her own brother.
Yep.
He's the dead guy who is responsible for pulling her out into the waiting zombies. It's like, oh my gosh. Like, I'd even forgotten about this guy from the beginning. And she was so concerned about her brother. And at one point early in the movie, she's insisting, he's out there, he's alive, we have to go get him. And there he is, dead, pulling her in, responsible for her demise. As a kid, that just crushed me.
It's so shocking because this is the character that you've been with from the beginning, and you don't expect her to die. It's kind of the Marion Crane and Psycho thing. Like, she's the main character, or at least from the beginning, she's the main character. Mm-hmm. And so you expect her to make it, and then to see her go. And yes, in such a tragic way, to be pulled in by the brother, like you said, that she was so concerned about. It is shocking. And I'm not surprised that audiences were shocked by a lot of the things that happen in this movie.
Well, then, it's all kind of chaos. Ben isn't there to help her. Harry stumbles downstairs with his fatal gunshot wound and just reaches out. It's really sad, actually. His daughter is still laid out downstairs, knocked out from, what we had learned a little earlier was an actual zombie bite.
Yeah.
Dying, and he just reaches towards her as he falls down to the ground. The mother, how was she? She made it up. I guess she was upstairs at some point, or she came back down.
Yeah, she had been up there, and she had been trying to keep the zombies out. It was actually Barbara came out of her catatonic state to kind of try to help.
That's right.
The mom. But then when Barbara got taken, I feel like the mom ran to the basement and ran downstairs. And this was another thing that absolutely shocked and appalled audiences and critics, was that the daughter Karen becomes a zombie. And when the mother, Helen, comes down, she sees Karen eating Harry, the dad. But it's a really interesting scene because while I'm sure she's horrified, at the same time, this is her daughter, and she's saying, "Oh, my baby," she doesn't retaliate immediately. She doesn't try to fight, and there's really kind of a graphic scene where the mom kind of falls back and is on the ground, and Karen gets like a gardening trowel and just stabs and stabs and stabs her, and you see the blood shooting all over the wall, and like it goes on for a while. It's pretty gross and intense, and people were shocked and appalled by this child killing their mother.
When you break this down, it is really upsetting. I mean, first of all, it is the most graphic scene by far in this entire movie. And even by today's standards, it's a very graphic scene. Of course, the fact that the daughter is killing her mother, to me, especially as a child, I was pretty brutalized by this point, by this movie.
Sure.
It just brings all these just sick feelings up from your stomach. But the fact that she's not she didn't descend on her and start biting into her neck. She looked at the wall, grabbed a gardening trowel, and decided to stab her.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is the way that Romero's zombies are working a little differently, than what we think of automatically when we think of zombies. The one earlier can pick up a brick, they can overturn cars, they can knock out...
Break out your headlights.
Yeah, exactly. And she chooses to pick a gardening trowel up off of the wall and to stab her mother with. And doesn't even eat her,
No.
By the time Ben retreats to the basement, it's the only place he has left to go to. He boards up the door, comes down, he sees this terrible scene, and he ends up shooting the girl.
Yeah.
So bold.
And shoots them all. Has to shoot them all because they are now zombies. And then this is the end. The zombies have gotten in the house. He's boarded himself up in the cellar. And, what's going to happen now? Well, apparently, as we've seen on the news in the last broadcast that we saw that law enforcement and the government and the army and all the special forces have figured out that these things are really not hard to kill. You just got to get them in the head. And so once they've done that, they've put together all of these posses and forces to go out and take them out, and it's being successful. And so the kind of the very last scene is we see that this group, it looks like a local group, like maybe led by some kind of local sheriff, right?
And the militia that he could rankle up.
The militia of good old boys, right? Yeah. Exactly. That they pulled together, and they're just going out and they're shooting these zombies in the head, and they've made their way to the farmhouse, and you see them just taking out the zombies left and right, just very easily and casually shooting them in the head and taking them down. And then you see Ben in the basement, and he hears this. It's muffled because he's down there, so it takes him a while to understand what's going on. But eventually he hears it, and he goes upstairs, and he's just, he's got his gun because he's, of course, frightened, and he's kind of looking out the window, and the sheriff just says, "Oh, there's another one, take him out." And the guy just shoots him in the head, and that's it. Like, what a crazy, shocking ending. And then they do this really cool thing as the credits roll where they show images of what's happening, but it's like it's really old school crime scene photos, like really gritty black and white crime scene photos. And you see that Ben's body gets thrown onto a huge heap of bodies right next to the very first zombie that we saw from the graveyard. And then they just get incinerated. I mean, it's so bleak. This guy had been so resourceful and so strong in the face of this terrible event. And then just to see him so casually taken out with no remorse, with no oops, with no, oh, darn it, we got the wrong guy. Nope. They just thought they shot another zombie, and he just got burned with the rest of them. Man.
By the good old boys.
Yeah, even the good old white boys. I'm sure that didn't go unnoticed. I am sure.
But, yeah. Plus, I thought those photos are very reminiscent of the photos of lynchings and things.
Yes, very reminiscent.
The burning. Oh my gosh! Like, I'm sorry, but that's where I look at it and I go, "There's no way Romero didn't know what he was doing here."
I know. I kind of feel the same way. But it's wild. I mean, it's such a bleak and dreary ending. But, oh, man, I mean, it's impactful. I mean, you feel it. It's a gut punch at the end that happens. Yeah. And we've already talked for way too long, so I'll try to be brief in this. But seriously, we could list a bazillion movies that were clearly directly inspired by this. Romero himself directed 5 more of the Dead movies after this. Dawn of the Dead, Fantastic. Extinction of the Dead, Land of the Dead, a bazillion. Yeah, and then because it's not copyrighted, it's been remade a bazillion times. It's been remade, it's been animated, it's been done in comic book form, it's been done on stage, it's been done everywhere. It's been done in different countries, it's been translated into like more than 25 different languages. Even movies that are not specifically about zombies, like The Evil Dead, Cabin in the Woods, where you get these people put into remote places with this threat coming from the outside. Just really virtually probably about 50 to 75% of our modern horror has in some way been influenced by this movie. It's so influential, and it's so... I just, if you're listening to this and you haven't seen it, you have to watch it. Like, it's a rule. Like,
it's a requirement. You cannot listen to this podcast any further. We will ban you.
Right.
There's a way
you are required to watch this movie. I mean, it just laid the foundation for so many of the things that I love and treasure. And I can't begin to express what respect I have for this man that we lost. He was an old man, and he had a very long, prolific, successful career. He preferred to stay more in the indie realm. His first studio movie, big studio movie, was a movie called Monkey Shines, which I remember from my childhood, and I remember really, really liking. In fact, I'd like for us to watch that at some point. But he did not have a good experience on it. He felt like there was too much meddling with the executives and the producers, and he just wanted to do his thing. And so he did. He kind of went back, and he did big budget movies beyond that because he was able to, because of the respect that he deserved. But just an artist, I can't imagine leaving that kind of legacy.
I, for one, I feel really fortunate to have grown up kind of at that crossroads where I did. Like I said, this movie, I saw it as a child, and so I didn't get to see a lot of the movies that inspired it until after I saw this one. So in many ways, I was really lucky seeing it as a child, as weird as that sounds. But, we talk about all these scenes and about how influential it is. It's just hard probably for a person nowadays to put themselves in that same place where they hadn't seen any of this before.
Right.
Just to know how impactful it could be. However, if you want to get a little bit of a contemporaneous account of this movie, go online and go to Roger Ebert's site. Another guy, may he rest in peace, one of my favorite film critics in the whole world, almost always agree with everything he says. He has a review where he went to see Night of the Living Dead when it came out with an audience full of mostly kids and teenagers. And most of his observations are about how the audience reacts to the movie. And it's really interesting to read because it perfectly mirrored how I, as a kid, reacted to the movie. So you should check that out as well. It's really good. I agree with you. I really like almost everything that Romero's done. It's not all perfect, but it all has heart, and you can tell this guy, as we said before when we reviewed Martin, he's a real artist. He really is. And it was probably better for him to work mostly independently as long as he could make it work financially, and he had his tough times, but I think he seemed to be pretty happy with where he ended up. We've gotten a good stable of really good, clever horror films. A man who, in many ways, elevated the whole genre.
Absolutely.
He gave it something to say. He showed that horror films could function, could be mainstream movies, and could be smart, and could be well made.
Yeah, and have something to say, yeah.
Yeah, and they really rose above a lot of the junk. The opportunistic, exploitative junk at the time. You can have an exploitation movie, but you can also have good exploitation movies, and his certainly were.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And before we sign out, I just want to say that it's really been a sad couple of weeks. We also lost Martin Landau, who was an amazing actor, not well known for horror by any means, but a couple of days ago, we also lost John Hurd, who everybody loves him from Home Alone, but he was also in Chud and Sharknado. So he did his time in the horror industry too. It's sad to lose these people that we've known for so long and that we've grown up with, but they leave behind something of a legacy, and it's nice to be able to remember them in that way. So George Romero and Martin Landau and John Hurd, we're still celebrating you wherever you may be. Thank you for everything that you've given us.
And don't come back and...
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, thank you for listening to another episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. You can find us on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, anywhere that your favorite podcasts are presented. You can also find us on Facebook, where we have a page there. You can like us there, share us there also, and join the conversation. Tell us what you think of this movie, and suggest movies you'd like us to do in the future. Until that time, I'm Todd.
And I'm Craig.
With two guys and a chainsaw.